At the end of the Second World War, Europe tries to rebuild itself and bring justice for the crimes committed during the conflict. While some of those responsible are arrested and tried, others manage to disappear amid the chaos of the post-war period. Klaus Barbie, former head of the Gestapo in Lyon and responsible for arrests, torture and deportations, is one of them. Taking advantage of the tensions of a world that would soon enter the Cold War, Barbie manages to flee Europe and rebuild his life under a false identity. For decades, he remains beyond the reach of justice until a long and persistent search finally brings him out of the shadows. Origins and youth in interwar Germany. Klaus Barbie was born on October 25, 1913 in Bad Godesberg, a small town located on the banks of the Rhine River within the German Empire. His childhood was marked from the outset by a deeply authoritarian and nationalist environment. His father, Nicholas Barbie, had been a non-commissioned officer in the German army during the First World War and returned from the front severely wounded, both physically and psychologically. Like many defeated veterans, he never accepted the German surrender or the new order imposed after the conflict. In the Barbie household, the defeat of 1918 was not seen as the result of a lost war, but as a betrayal. This resentment, common in broad sectors of German society, was passed directly to young Klaus from an early age. Strict discipline, physical punishment, and absolute obedience were part of his daily upbringing. According to later testimonies, his father exercised a harsh and violent authority, convinced that Germany had been unjustly humiliated by its enemies. The Germany in which Klaus Barbie grew up was a profoundly unstable country. After the war, the newly created Weimar Republic faced constant economic crises, runaway inflation, massive unemployment, and extreme political polarization. The streets were filled with clashes between communists, nationalists, and paramilitary groups. For a young generation like Barbie's, parliamentary democracy seemed weak and incapable of restoring national pride. During his adolescence, Barbie attended schools where nationalism and historical revisionism were common even before Hitler came to power. The memory of Germany's past greatness and the idea of an internal enemy who had caused the defeat began to take deep root in his mindset. He did not particularly stand out for academic achievements, but he did for his reserved, disciplined character and his ability to submit to authority without questioning it. The economic crisis of 1929, which hit Germany hard, finished radicalizing broad sectors of the youth. Millions of families were ruined and youth unemployment skyrocketed. For many young people, nationalist movements offered something the state could not: identity, purpose, and a sense of belonging. Klaus Barbie was no exception. At the beginning of the 1930s, the National Socialist Party began to gain strength in an unstoppable manner. Its messages of order, revenge, and national regeneration resonated with young people frustrated by poverty and international humiliation. Barbie observed how Nazi youth organizations grew rapidly, presenting themselves as a clear alternative to the political and social chaos of the Weimar Republic. In this context, the figure of Adolf Hitler emerged as a symbol of authority, strength, and national redemption. For many young Germans, Hitler represented the end of disorder and the return of a strong Germany. Klaus Barbie, shaped by an authoritarian childhood and a youth marked by crisis, found in that discourse a structure that gave meaning to his surroundings. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Klaus Barbie was barely 19 years old. For him and for an entire generation, the new regime was not perceived as a rupture, but as a solution. The state now offered a clear path for social advancement: obedience, loyalty, and service. That path would lead, a few years later, to his integration into one of the most feared repressive apparatuses of the Third Reich. The impact of Nazism and ideological radicalization. At the beginning of the 1930s, the rise of National Socialism radically transformed the political, social, and cultural life of Germany. For a young generation like that of Klaus Barbie, Nazism did not appear as an extreme ideology, but as an orderly response to years of humiliation, economic crisis, and street violence. The new regime knew how to present itself as a movement of national regeneration, capable of restoring the pride lost after the defeat of 1918 and of offering stability in a country exhausted by uncertainty. The arrival of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933 marked a point of no return. The German state quickly became a totalitarian system in which propaganda penetrated all aspects of daily life. Schools, youth organizations, media outlets, and public events transmitted the same message. Germany had been betrayed, was surrounded by enemies, and only absolute unity under strong leadership would guarantee its survival. For many young people, this discourse offered a simple and forceful explanation for complex problems, channeling personal frustration toward a collective cause. In this context, Nazi ideology was not imposed solely by force, but also by seduction. It promised belonging, status, and purpose. The regime exalted values such as discipline, obedience, sacrifice, and loyalty, presenting them as supreme virtues of the German citizen. For someone like Klaus Barbie, raised in an authoritarian environment and accustomed to a rigid worldview, these principles fit almost naturally with his personal formation. Ideological radicalization was not an immediate process, but a gradual one. It began with passive acceptance of the official discourse and advanced toward an active identification with its objectives. Anti-Semitism, for example, was normalized through laws, caricatures, speeches, and progressive exclusions that dehumanized entire communities. By turning certain groups into scapegoats, the regime offered a clear narrative. Germany's problems were not structural, but the product of internal and external enemies who had to be eliminated. Nazism also redefined the concept of morality. Actions that would previously have been considered unacceptable came to be justified as necessary for the survival of the state. Violence ceased to be seen as an evil and began to be presented as a legitimate tool. This change was crucial in the formation of men who, like Barbie, would end up performing repressive functions. The ideology not only allowed violence, but glorified it when it was exercised in the name of the Reich. Another key factor was the militarization of society. From an early age, young people were trained physically and mentally to obey orders without questioning them. Hierarchy and absolute authority became unquestionable pillars. Critical thinking was replaced by the repetition of slogans, and individual identity was subordinated to the collective identity of the German people. In this environment, the dehumanization of the enemy became almost automatic. For Klaus Barbie, Nazism also offered a path of social advancement. In a society where opportunities had been limited for years, the regime opened doors to those who demonstrated ideological loyalty and a willingness to serve. Commitment to the system was not only a political matter, but a personal investment. The more someone became involved in the apparatus of the state, the more difficult it was to distance oneself from it, even in the face of its excesses. Radicalization was also reinforced by the regime's initial success. The reduction of unemployment, major infrastructure projects, and the apparent restoration of order gave credibility to the Nazi discourse. For many Germans, these achievements seemed to confirm that the chosen path was the correct one. Moral doubts were eclipsed by the sensation of progress and national strength. Over time, this combination of constant propaganda, personal benefits, social pressure, and the absence of effective dissent created an environment in which Nazi ideology was not only accepted but deeply internalized. In the case of Klaus Barbie, this internalization laid the foundations of his future conduct. The regime did not transform him overnight, but it did progressively shape his worldview, nullifying empathy toward those defined as enemies and legitimizing the extreme use of violence as a duty. When Germany began its territorial expansion and the repressive machinery was set in motion on a large scale, men like Barbie no longer saw themselves as mere executors of orders, but as necessary pieces of a historical project. The ideology had fulfilled its function, turning ordinary individuals into convinced agents of a system that admitted no questioning. At that point, radicalization was no longer only political, it was total, and it would have devastating consequences in the years that followed. Entry into the Nazi Party and the SS. In the years immediately following the consolidation of Nazi power, joining the National Socialist Party and its associated organizations became a decisive choice for many young Germans. For Klaus Barbie, this step was not an impulsive or exceptional act, but rather the logical consequence of a prior process of radicalization and of a social environment that rewarded ideological loyalty. By the mid-1930s, Nazism was no longer just a political movement, but the central axis of the German state, and being part of it meant securing a place within the new order. Barbie joined the Nazi Party in 1935. At that time, membership did not necessarily imply an immediate active role in repression, but it did require a formal adherence to the principles of the regime. The party functioned as a filter. It made it possible to identify those who shared the ideological vision of the state and were willing to put it into practice. For many young people without clear prospects for the future, militancy offered stability, recognition, and a possible career within the administration or the security forces. Shortly thereafter, Klaus Barbie took a more decisive step by joining the Schutzstaffel, the SS. Unlike the Nazi Party, the SS represented an ideological and racial elite within the system. It was not merely a paramilitary organization, but a body conceived as the guardian of National Socialism, tasked with protecting the regime from internal and external enemies. The selection process was stricter and required demonstrating racial purity, absolute discipline, and unquestionable loyalty to the Führer. The appeal of the SS lay both in its aura of power and in the opportunities it offered. For a young man like Barbie, who did not stand out for his academic training but did for his willingness to obey and carry out orders, the SS represented a clear path of advancement. The organization promoted a culture of total obedience and eliminated any space for moral doubt. The individual was subordinated to the collective mission, and violence was conceived as a legitimate tool in the service of the state. After his entry, Barbie was assigned to administrative and training tasks within the security apparatus. This initial period was key to his professional development. Instead of sending him directly to the front, the regime trained him in techniques of surveillance, social control, and counterinsurgency. These skills would later be fundamental. The training was not limited to technical aspects. It included intense ideological indoctrination intended to reinforce the perception of the enemy and to justify any action in the name of the security of the Reich. During this process, anti-Semitism and anti-communism ceased to be simple, abstract ideas and became integrated into everyday practice. Members of the SS learned to identify potential threats in any form of dissent and to consider preventive repression as a necessity. This approach dehumanized adversaries and facilitated the normalization of brutality. For Barbie, this environment reinforced a binary worldview in which there was no room for compassion toward those defined as enemies of the state. Advancement within the SS depended less on individual merit in conventional terms and more on ideological reliability. Barbie proved to be a disciplined and efficient member, qualities highly valued in an organization that prioritized obedience and the execution of orders. His ability to adapt to the system and comply without questioning allowed him to advance gradually in the hierarchy. Each promotion reinforced his commitment to the regime and made any form of distancing more difficult. The structure of the SS also fostered a strong sense of internal camaraderie. Members saw themselves as part of an elite separate from the rest of society, united by a historic mission. This collective identity strengthened cohesion and reduced the possibility of questioning the group's actions. In this context, Klaus Barbie was not an isolated individual but a piece integrated into a much broader machinery, designed to exercise control and repression in a systematic manner. By the late 1930s, with Germany heading toward war, the SS rapidly expanded its functions. From being an internal protection force, they came to play a central role in the occupation of territories and in the implementation of repressive policies. For men like Barbie, this meant new opportunities to demonstrate their usefulness to the regime. War not only legitimized violence, but turned it into an everyday tool of state power. Klaus Barbie's entry into the Nazi Party and the SS marked a definitive turning point in his life. From that moment on, his destiny became tied to that of the regime. Ideology, hierarchical structure, and personal rewards created a path from which it would become increasingly difficult to deviate. What began as a choice within a context of crisis and propaganda would end by leading him to become one of the most feared agents of Nazi repression in occupied Europe. Training and advancement within the security apparatus. After joining the SS, Klaus Barbie began a training process carefully designed to turn him into an efficient functionary of the repressive apparatus of the Third Reich. This period was decisive not only for his career but for the way in which he internalized the logic of institutionalized violence. The Nazi regime understood that repression could not depend solely on fanaticism. It needed trained cadres capable of applying control policies with method, consistency, and coldness. Barbie was one of those cadres. His initial training took place within the structures linked to the Security Service, SD, and the Security Police, bodies that acted as fundamental pillars of the Nazi state's surveillance system. There he received instruction in interrogation techniques, information gathering, surveillance of suspects, and analysis of clandestine political networks. These teachings were presented as administrative and security tasks, deliberately stripped of any moral consideration. The objective was clear: to train functionaries who would carry out orders without questioning them and who would understand repression as a technical procedure. Ideological indoctrination accompanied each phase of the training. Future officers were constantly told that Germany was surrounded by enemies and that the survival of the Reich depended on the preventive elimination of any internal threat. Communism, Judaism, and political dissent were described as destructive forces operating in the shadows. This discourse not only justified repression but turned it into a patriotic duty. For Barbie, these ideas reinforced a worldview in which violence ceased to be exceptional and became a legitimate tool. During his first assignments, Barbie stood out for his discipline and his ability to adapt quickly to the demands of the system. He was not a brilliant ideologue or a charismatic leader, but he was an effective executor. In a bureaucratic apparatus like the Nazi one, these qualities were essential. The regime valued those who could carry out orders with precision and without hesitation, and Barbie proved to fit that profile perfectly. His superiors saw in him a reliable functionary, someone who raised no problems or doubts. Advancement within the security apparatus did not depend solely on seniority, but on the constant demonstration of loyalty and effectiveness. Each well-prepared report, each operation carried out without errors, reinforced the confidence of his superiors. Barbie was progressively assigned to tasks of greater responsibility, which allowed him to acquire direct experience in counterinsurgency operations and population control. These early experiences accustomed him to dealing with detainees and suspects, normalizing practices that outside that context would have been considered extreme. A central aspect of his training was the bureaucratization of violence. In the Nazi security apparatus, repression was organized through reports, lists, files, and written orders. This structure allowed its members to distance themselves emotionally from the consequences of their actions. Klaus Barbie learned to see people as numbers, names in documents, or abstract threats. This process of dehumanization was key to his later evolution and to the brutality he would exercise during the war. With the start of the conflict in 1939, opportunities for advancement multiplied. German territorial expansion required trained personnel to administer the occupied territories and repress any form of resistance. The security apparatus became a central piece of the occupation, and officers with prior training, like Barbie, were considered especially valuable. The war accelerated careers that in peacetime would have advanced more slowly. As he advanced in the hierarchy, Barbie became increasingly integrated into the internal culture of the SS and the Gestapo. This culture reinforced the idea of belonging to an elite tasked with protecting the Reich at any cost. Professional success and internal recognition strengthened his commitment to the system and reduced any possibility of questioning. In this environment, obedience was not only an obligation, but a source of identity and status. Klaus Barbie's rise within the security apparatus was not the result of a single extraordinary act, but of an accumulation of decisions and behaviors aligned with the expectations of the regime. His technical training, his ideological indoctrination, and his ability to carry out orders without hesitation turned him into an effective cog in the Nazi repressive machinery. When he was assigned to occupied France, he was no longer simply a young party member, but an experienced functionary, fully integrated into a system that made repression an administrative routine. This stage of training and advancement laid the foundations for everything that would come afterward. Upon arriving in Lyon, Klaus Barbie had the preparation, mindset, and institutional backing necessary to exercise almost absolute power. The Nazi security apparatus had fulfilled its function. It had shaped an individual capable of applying violence systematically, convinced that he was acting in the name of the state and of a higher cause. Destination in occupied France. Arrival in Lyon. In 1942, when the war in Europe had entered a decisive phase, Klaus Barbie was assigned to occupied France, a territory that had become a strategic priority for the Third Reich. After the French defeat of 1940, Germany not only sought to exploit resources and maintain military control, but also to crush any form of internal resistance. In this context, the Nazi security apparatus played a fundamental role, and officers with experience in repression and counterinsurgency, like Barbie, were considered especially useful. Lyon occupied a singular position within wartime France. Located in the zone initially controlled by the Vichy regime, the city had been transformed into a nerve center of the French resistance. Its geographic location, its railway network, and its political tradition made it a key point for the coordination of clandestine movements, the passage of persecuted people, and the organization of sabotage. For the German authorities, Lyon represented a problem that had to be resolved quickly and forcefully. When Barbie arrived in the city, he was assigned to the local Gestapo as head of Section 4, responsible for the fight against the resistance and for matters related to Jews and political opponents. This position granted him considerable power. It was not merely an administrative post, but a position from which he could order arrests, direct interrogations, and coordinate repressive operations with other German forces and French collaborators. Barbie's arrival coincided with a general hardening of the German occupation. As the war dragged on and the resistance grew, Berlin demanded faster and harsher results. Repression had to be exemplary, capable of instilling fear and dismantling clandestine networks. In this environment, Barbie found the perfect setting to apply everything he had learned during his training. Lyon became a laboratory of total control, where violence was not only tolerated but expected. From the very first moment, Barbie imposed a style of command based on intimidation and bureaucratic efficiency. He centralized information, reorganized files, and established strict procedures for tracking suspects. The Gestapo of Lyon began to operate with a systematic logic, identifying targets, infiltrating informants, and carrying out coordinated raids. This structure made it possible to act quickly and minimize the chances of error. The Gestapo building on Rue Sainte-Catherine became the epicenter of terror in the city. There, detainees were taken to be interrogated. For the local population, the mere rumor of being summoned to that place was enough to generate panic. Barbie personally supervised many of these operations, and his presence reinforced the image of an implacable authority. At this point, he was no longer just an obedient official, but an active agent of the occupying terror. Barbie's relationship with the French collaborationist authorities was complex. Although the Vichy regime cooperated with Germany, there were constant tensions and blurred limits. Barbie knew how to exploit these cracks, using both collaboration and coercion to obtain information and logistical support. His ability to maneuver within this political framework allowed him to expand his influence and act with relative autonomy. The city of Lyon, with its intense clandestine activity, also offered Barbie the possibility of demonstrating concrete results to his superiors. Each dismantled network, each captured resistance leader reinforced his reputation within the Nazi apparatus. Operational success translated into greater room for maneuver and constant validation of his methods. In this context, brutality was not seen as an excess, but as proof of effectiveness. The arrival of Klaus Barbie in Lyon marked a turning point for the city and for his own trajectory. There he found the ideal setting to exercise almost absolute power over the life and death of thousands of people. The combination of a hostile territory, an active resistance, and a repressive apparatus determined to impose terror created the conditions for his figure to be consolidated as one of the most feared of the German occupation in France. This stage not only defined his role during the war, but sealed his historical reputation. In Lyon, Barbie ceased to be just another cog in the system and became a symbol of Nazi terror. Everything that would come afterward, the persecution, the flight, and the long road to justice, would have its origin in those years in which the city lived under the control of a man trained to repress without limits. The Gestapo of Lyon and the repression of the resistance. Once established in his position, Klaus Barbie turned the Gestapo of Lyon into one of the most feared repressive instruments of occupied France. The city, already marked by intense clandestine activity, came to live under a regime of constant surveillance where the boundary between daily life and permanent danger became almost invisible. The Gestapo was not just a secret police. It was an omnipresent presence that infiltrated neighborhoods, factories, universities, and social networks, generating a climate of fear that paralyzed the population. The French resistance in Lyon was composed of a complex network of groups with different ideologies and objectives, from Gaullists to communists, including humanitarian organizations dedicated to hiding Jews or facilitating escape routes. For Barbie and his team, this diversity represented an operational challenge, but also an opportunity. The strategy consisted of fragmenting those networks, infiltrating informants, and using the information obtained under interrogation to provoke chain arrests. Each capture was not an end in itself, but the beginning of a broader operation. The Gestapo of Lyon functioned with a meticulous logic. Arrests were carried out selectively, often at night or at dawn, to maximize psychological impact. Detainees were transferred to interrogation centers where they were isolated from the outside world. The objective was not only to obtain immediate information, but to break the prisoners' moral resistance and, through them, dismantle entire structures. In this system, time played in favor of the repressors. The longer the isolation, the greater the pressure. Klaus Barbie personally supervised many of these operations. His role was not limited to administrative coordination. He actively participated in directing interrogations and in making decisions about the fate of detainees. Under his command, the Gestapo adopted methods of extreme harshness that sought the total submission of the prisoner. Violence became an everyday language, normalized within an apparatus that viewed the resistance not as combatants, but as criminals to be eliminated. One of the most devastating aspects of this repression was its systematic nature. These were not isolated acts, but a deliberate policy. Each blow against the resistance was designed to serve as a warning to the rest of the population. Executions, deportations, and disappearances had an exemplary effect. The message was clear: any form of opposition would be punished without hesitation. This planned terror managed, in many cases, to temporarily slow clandestine activity, although it never succeeded in eradicating it completely. The persecution of the resistance became closely intertwined with the persecution of the Jewish population. The Gestapo of Lyon played a key role in the identification, detention, and deportation of Jews to extermination camps. Entire families were torn from their homes, often after anonymous denunciations or meticulous investigations. In this context, political repression and genocide reinforced each other, forming part of the same logic of eliminating the enemy. One of the most emblematic episodes of this stage was the capture of important figures of the resistance, among them Jean Moulin, one of the key personalities in the unification of the French clandestine movements. His arrest represented a severe symbolic and operational blow. For the Gestapo of Lyon, this type of capture was presented as great successes, proof of the effectiveness of the repressive system and of Barbie's leadership. For the resistance, on the other hand, they were tragedies that underscored the human cost of the struggle. The impact of these actions extended beyond the individuals directly affected. The repression profoundly altered the social life of Lyon. Distrust took hold among neighbors, co-workers, and even family members. Fear of denunciation fragmented entire communities. The Gestapo knew how to exploit this climate, using informants and local collaborators to expand its reach. In this way, the German occupation was imposed not only by force, but also through the decomposition of the social fabric. Despite the brutality, the resistance did not disappear. It adapted, changed methods, and continued operating, albeit at an ever greater cost. This constant confrontation intensified the spiral of violence. For Barbie and his circle, each act of resistance justified new repressive measures, harsher and broader. The logic was circular and self-destructive, but deeply coherent within the ideological framework of Nazism. The Gestapo of Lyon, under the direction of Klaus Barbie, thus became a symbol of the terror of the German occupation in France. Its functioning reflected the essence of the Nazi repressive apparatus: bureaucratic, ideologized, and ruthless. This stage definitively consolidated Barbie's reputation as one of the most feared agents of the Reich, and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the city. The crimes committed during these years not only marked the direct victims, but defined the historical legacy of Klaus Barbie. It was in Lyon where his name became forever associated with torture, persecution, and death. And it would be precisely that past, built at the heart of the repression against the resistance, that decades later would return to haunt him when justice finally reached his name. The Butcher of Lyon: torture, deportations, and terror. As the months passed, the name Klaus Barbie began to take on a meaning that went beyond his official position. In Lyon and its surroundings, his figure was transformed into a symbol of absolute terror, to the point that the population began to refer to him as the Butcher of Lyon. This nickname did not arise from Allied propaganda or later reconstructions, but from the daily fear of those who lived under his rule. It represented the personification of repression without limits, systematic and deliberately cruel. Torture became a central tool in the functioning of the Gestapo in Lyon. It was not an exceptional resource reserved for extreme cases, but a common practice integrated into the interrogation process. The objective was not limited to obtaining immediate information. It sought to destroy detainees psychologically and physically, to turn them into examples of the absolute power of the German occupation. Under Barbie's direct supervision, pain was used as a method of control and as a message to the rest of the population. Interrogations were carried out in different detention centers, but the most feared was the Gestapo headquarters in the city. There, prisoners were subjected to beatings, humiliations, sleep deprivation, and other forms of extreme violence. The constant repetition of these practices generated a normalization of horror within the repressive apparatus. For the agents, brutality ceased to be a conscious act and became just another administrative routine. Barbie was not a mere observer of these methods. Numerous later testimonies pointed to his direct participation in torture sessions, as well as his presence during decisive interrogations. His cold and distant attitude reinforced the feeling that there was no moral limit. For the victims, facing him meant facing a power that did not seek justice or order, but total submission. Torture did not only affect active members of the resistance. Civilians accused of collaborating were also victims, as well as people detained by mistake or simply individuals denounced by neighbors. The system of denunciations, encouraged by the Gestapo, amplified the scope of terror. A mere suspicion was enough to end up in the hands of the repressive apparatus. This climate of permanent insecurity was one of the most effective weapons of the occupation. At the same time, deportations intensified. Under the responsibility of the Gestapo in Lyon, hundreds of Jews were arrested and sent to transit camps such as Drancy before being deported to Auschwitz and other extermination centers. Entire families disappeared without leaving a trace. For the Nazi machinery, these deportations were logistical operations. For the victims, they were death sentences. Barbie played a key role in the identification and arrest of these people, integrating genocide into his daily work. One of the most tragic episodes associated with his name was the roundup against Jewish children hidden in religious institutions and clandestine homes. These acts had a profound impact on the French collective memory, not only because of the magnitude of the crime, but because of its deliberate and planned character. Terror did not distinguish between combatants and civilians, between adults and children. This absolute indifference toward human life defined Barbie's legacy in Lyon. The use of terror as a political tool sought to break the will of resistance of the population. Public executions, disappearances, and collective reprisals were part of a strategy aimed at demonstrating that any challenge would be punished in a disproportionate manner. In many cases, the bodies of the victims were not returned to their families, which prolonged the suffering and fueled uncertainty. Fear thus became a permanent state. Despite this climate of horror, the resistance continued to exist. However, each clandestine action involved an increasingly greater risk. The repression directed by Barbie raised the human cost of the struggle, leaving deep scars on those who survived. The Butcher of Lyon not only destroyed lives, but irreversibly altered the social fabric of the region. With the advance of the war and the progressive weakening of the Third Reich, violence did not diminish. On the contrary, in many cases it intensified. Faced with the possibility of a German defeat, the Gestapo redoubled its efforts to eliminate its enemies before losing control. This final radicalization left a trail of death that would forever mark the historical memory of Lyon. The nickname Butcher of Lyon brutally but precisely summarizes this stage. It is not just an emotional label, but a description of a man who embodied the most extreme logic of the Nazi system. Torture, deportations, and terror were not isolated excesses, but essential components of his actions. It was during these years that Klaus Barbie definitively crossed the line that would make him, decades later, one of the most sought-after and prosecuted war criminals of the 20th century. This phase of his life explains why his name survived the collapse of the Reich. When the war ended and many tried to hide their past, the crimes committed in Lyon remained alive in the memory of the victims and of the city. It would be this persistent and painful memory that would drive the long pursuit that would eventually reach him long afterward. The collapse of the Reich and the opportunity to escape. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the Third Reich began to show clear signs of collapse. From late 1943, and above all during 1944, the German military situation deteriorated rapidly on all fronts. The Allied landing in Normandy, the unstoppable Soviet advance from the east, and the constant bombings of German cities marked the beginning of the end. In occupied territories such as France, this reality translated into a progressive weakening of German control and an increase in resistance activity. In Lyon, the authority of the Gestapo began to crack. Although repression continued to be brutal, the balance of power was changing. Resistance networks were strengthening, had better coordination, and received direct support from the Allies. Desertions, lack of resources, and uncertainty affected even the most committed cadres of the Nazi apparatus. Klaus Barbie, who had exercised his power with relative impunity for years, began to perceive that his position was no longer secure. The summer of 1944 was decisive. After the liberation of Paris in August, the Allied advance toward the interior of France accelerated. German forces began a disorderly retreat, trying to save what remained of their presence in the country. In this context, many SS and Gestapo officers understood that defeat was inevitable and that their future would depend on their ability to disappear. For men like Barbie, whose actions had left a deep trail of crimes, capture almost certainly meant a trial and a severe sentence. The German retreat was not only a military withdrawal, but also a political and personal flight. Documents were destroyed, archives burned, and evidence eliminated in a desperate attempt to erase responsibilities. In Lyon, the Gestapo tried to dismantle its own structures before abandoning the city. However, fear was no longer only on the side of the civilian population. For the first time, the repressors faced the real possibility of being held accountable. Klaus Barbie left Lyon along with other German units, integrating into the chaotic flow of troops heading east. This displacement marked the end of his stage as a dominant authority and the beginning of a new phase, individual survival. The man who had represented the terror of the occupier became a fugitive, aware that his name was known and that his crimes had not gone unnoticed. During the last months of the war, the Reich collapsed from within. Nazi propaganda continued to proclaim resistance until the end, but the reality on the ground was very different. Cities fell one after another, communications broke down, and Central Command lost control. In this climate of chaos, a window of opportunity opened for many war criminals. The confusion allowed them to hide among millions of defeated and displaced soldiers. Barbie knew how to take advantage of this context. Unlike other fanatically committed officers who remained at their posts until the end, he chose evasion. The priority ceased to be the Reich and became his own life. This change did not imply repentance or moral reflection, but a cold calculation. Surviving meant disappearing, erasing traces, and adopting new identities if necessary. After the German capitulation in May 1945, Europe was plunged into chaos. Millions of prisoners of war, refugees, and displaced persons moved along roads and fields. The Allied forces had the monumental task of administering devastated territories and identifying those responsible for the Nazi regime. However, the magnitude of the disaster made absolute control impossible. In that administrative and human vacuum, many former members of the Nazi apparatus found temporary refuge. Klaus Barbie was initially captured by US forces, but this episode did not mean the end of his freedom. In the emerging post-war context, priorities began to change rapidly. The confrontation between former allies gave way to a new global tension, the Cold War. The fight against communism became a central objective for the United States and its intelligence services, and this new reality profoundly altered the fate of many former Nazis. For Barbie, the collapse of the Reich was not only a defeat, but an opportunity. The very system that had been destroyed by his crimes left behind a confused world where information was fragmented and alliances were being redefined. In that context, his experience in repression and the fight against clandestine movements began to acquire new strategic value for other actors. Thus, the end of the war did not mean the end of Klaus Barbie's story. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a prolonged and carefully calculated escape. The fall of the Third Reich opened an unexpected door to escape justice, a door that Barbie knew how to cross by taking advantage of chaos, new political priorities, and the lack of an effective international system to immediately judge all those responsible. This moment of transition, in which a war criminal went from executioner to fugitive, is key to understanding how Klaus Barbie managed to avoid for decades the consequences of his actions. The opportunity to escape did not arise out of nowhere. It was the direct result of the collapse of an empire, the chaos of the post-war period, and a world that quickly began to look toward a new enemy. Allied protection and evasion networks in the post-war period. After the end of the Second World War, Europe did not immediately enter a stage of justice and clear accountability. On the contrary, the continent was plunged into profound political, administrative, and moral confusion. In that ambiguous context, Klaus Barbie found not only the possibility of escape, but also unexpected forms of protection. The post-war period was not only the stage for the Nuremberg trials, but also the beginning of a new global confrontation that transformed former enemies into potential allies. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allied forces faced a colossal task: administering devastated territories, repatriating millions of people, and locating thousands of those responsible for the Nazi regime. The initial priority was stability. In that scenario, not all war criminals were identified immediately, and many managed to hide among rank-and-file soldiers, displaced persons, and refugees. Klaus Barbie was one of them, although his case would go far beyond simple anonymity. Barbie was detained by US forces shortly after the end of the war. However, his full record was not immediately understood, or more precisely, was not considered a priority. At that time, US intelligence services were reorganizing and redefining their objectives. The threat that was beginning to cause concern was no longer defeated Nazism, but the expansion of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. The Cold War was being born, and with it, a new strategic logic emerged. In this new context, former members of the Nazi apparatus began to be seen in a different light. Many of them possessed experience in fighting clandestine movements, espionage, and repression of communist organizations. Klaus Barbie fit perfectly into this profile. His past as head of the Gestapo in Lyon, responsible for combating resistance networks, was reinterpreted as a useful qualification for the new ideological confrontation. US intelligence, particularly the Counterintelligence Corps, decided to use Barbie as an informant and collaborator. This decision implied, de facto, protecting him from extradition to France, where he was already being sought for war crimes. During this period, Barbie provided information on communist networks, former contacts, and clandestine structures in Germany and Europe. In exchange, he received protection, a new identity, and the possibility of remaining out of reach of French justice. This cover-up was not an isolated accident, but part of a broader practice. In the early years of the Cold War, several former Nazis were recruited or protected by Western powers under the argument that the main enemy had changed. The logic was pragmatic and deeply controversial. Strategic security was prioritized over historical justice. Klaus Barbie became one of the most extreme examples of this policy. As French pressure increased, Barbie's situation began to become uncomfortable even for his protectors. French authorities insisted on his extradition, and his name appeared with increasing frequency in investigations into crimes committed during the occupation. To avoid a diplomatic scandal, a key decision was made to help him disappear definitively from Europe. It was at this point that the so-called evasion networks, popularly known as rat lines, came into action. These clandestine routes, organized by former Nazis, sympathizers, and in some cases with the complicity of ecclesiastical sectors and intelligence services, facilitated the escape of war criminals to distant destinations. Italy became a fundamental transit point from where many fugitives departed for Latin America. Klaus Barbie was transferred through these networks with false documents that granted him a new identity. Under the name Klaus Altmann, he managed to leave Europe without being detained. This process was not improvised. It required contacts, protection, and an organized structure that guaranteed his security at each stage of the journey. The effectiveness of these networks demonstrates the extent to which the post-war period was marked by profound moral contradictions. Barbie's escape was not a simple individual flight, but the result of concrete political decisions. The Allied protection he received, directly or indirectly, allowed one of the most notorious criminals of the Nazi regime to evade justice for decades. This fact raises one of the most uncomfortable questions of the post-war period: how the fight against a new enemy led to relativizing the crimes of the past. Once outside Europe, Barbie disappeared from the public radar. For the French authorities and for the victims, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. However, his story was far from over. The network that had protected him and facilitated his escape could not erase the memories or the testimonies of his crimes. Although for years he lived in relative tranquility, the past remained present, waiting for the moment to reappear. Allied protection and evasion networks not only prolonged Klaus Barbie's freedom but also delayed the process of historical justice. This period demonstrates that the end of the war did not bring with it a clean break with the past, but rather a transition full of shadows. The story of Barbie in the post-war period is the story of a world that, in the name of security and politics, allowed the executioner to become a protected fugitive. That fragile balance, sustained by silence and convenience, would end up breaking decades later. Because although he managed to escape from Europe, Klaus Barbie never truly escaped from memory or from the consequences of his actions. The next stage of his life, in Latin America, would open a new chapter marked by exile, impunity, and finally the return of justice. The flight from Europe and the journey toward South America. Klaus Barbie's flight from Europe was not an impulsive act nor an improvised escape, but a carefully organized process that reflected the morally ambiguous climate of the immediate post-war period. By then, Barbie already understood that his stay on the European continent was unsustainable in the long term. Although he had enjoyed protection and cover, his name was beginning to circulate more insistently among investigators, journalists, and French authorities. The memory of the crimes committed in Lyon remained alive, and the pressure to locate those responsible increased as the years passed. In this context, the decision to leave Europe became a matter of survival. Post-war Germany was under occupation, fragmented, and under surveillance. The Allied powers, despite their contradictions, were slowly beginning to consolidate more effective judicial and administrative mechanisms. For a man like Barbie, whose involvement in torture, deportations, and murders was widely documented, the risk of ultimately being handed over to justice was real. The escape process relied on clandestine networks that already existed, formed during the final years of the conflict and perfected after the German defeat. These networks, later known as rat lines, were composed of former members of the Nazi regime, collaborators, civilian intermediaries, and figures who acted driven by ideological, economic, or strategic interests. Their objective was clear: to remove former leaders and compromised agents from Europe before they could be tried. Italy became one of the main transit points. In a country devastated by the war, with weakened institutions and millions of displaced persons, document forgery and clandestine mobility were relatively simple. Barbie was transferred to this region under a false identity, progressively distancing himself from the territories where his face and his name were known. Each step of the journey involved a change of contacts, temporary shelters, and a strict compartmentalization of information to reduce risks. Obtaining a new identity was a central element of the escape. Klaus Barbie officially left behind his name and his past to become Klaus Altmann. This transformation was not only bureaucratic but symbolic. It implied a formal break with his previous life and the adoption of an existence built on silence and denial. The false documents, which included travel permits and personal certificates, allowed him to present himself as just another civilian amid the migratory chaos of the time. The journey toward South America was neither immediate nor simple. Before crossing the Atlantic, Barbie passed through various waiting points where he remained in the shadows, avoiding drawing attention. These stays could be prolonged for weeks or months, depending on the availability of transport and the political situation. The fear of being recognized or denounced was always present, but the effectiveness of the evasion networks and the magnitude of the migratory movement played in his favor. South America had become a favored destination for many European fugitives. Countries such as Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia offered a combination of receptive governments, lax immigration controls, and opportunities to rebuild a life far from international scrutiny. In addition, the geographic and cultural distance from Europe provided an additional layer of security. For Barbie, this continent represented the possibility of disappearing definitively. The crossing of the ocean marked a point of no return. By embarking for America, Barbie left behind not only Europe, but also the immediate setting of his crimes. However, that past traveled with him, albeit hidden. The voyage was, in practical terms, the moment when impunity seemed to be consolidated. Far from European courts and protected by a new identity, the Butcher of Lyon seemed to have achieved the unthinkable: escape. Once in South America, Klaus Barbie began the slow process of reintegrating into a society that was unaware of his true history. Anonymity, at least in appearance, was total. In that new environment, the war was a distant memory, and the names of those responsible for Nazi terror were barely known outside specialized circles. This disconnection allowed many fugitives to live for years without being bothered. The flight from Europe and the journey towards South America not only reflect the cunning and coldness of Klaus Barbie, but also the structural failures of the post-war world. His escape was possible thanks to a web of interests, silences, and political priorities that relegated justice in favor of stability or strategic convenience. Each stage of the journey shows how the military defeat of Nazism did not automatically mean the defeat of all its actors. This journey marked the beginning of a new life built on false identities and opportunistic alliances. But it also sowed the seeds of a future reckoning, because although he managed to cross oceans and change his name, the memory of his crimes did not disappear. It remained latent, waiting for the moment when the world, decades later, would turn its gaze back to South America to find one of the men who had managed to escape when Europe lay in ruins. New identity and life in Bolivia. When Klaus Barbie arrived in Bolivia at the beginning of the 1950s, he did so under a completely new identity and with the determination never to be the man he had been in Europe again, at least in a visible way. He was now called Klaus Altmann, just another German citizen fleeing the devastation of post-war Europe in search of opportunities on a distant continent. Bolivia, a politically unstable country with little international attention and wide margins for anonymity, offered the ideal environment for someone who needed to disappear. Barbie's new identity was not just a false name, but a carefully constructed biography. He presented himself as a businessman, a specialized technician, and a man with no relevant political past. In a country where thousands of European immigrants arrived every year, many of them with incomplete or difficult-to-verify histories, his story did not arouse immediate suspicion. The distance from Europe and the lack of effective mechanisms for international cooperation made it easier for his past to remain buried. During his first years in Bolivia, Barbie led a discreet life. He initially settled in La Paz and began to build a network of commercial and social contacts. His discipline, organizational capacity, and administrative experience, acquired during his career in the Nazi apparatus, allowed him to adapt quickly. He knew how to move with ease in business and bureaucratic environments, projecting an image of efficiency and reliability. Over time, Klaus Altmann established himself as a respectable man within certain circles. He founded companies dedicated to transport and trade, activities that allowed him to generate stable income and at the same time establish ties with local authorities. Bolivia was going through frequent changes of government, coup d'état, and institutional crises, which created a climate in which foreign figures with experience in organization and security could be attractive to sectors of power. One of the most disturbing elements of this stage was the invisible continuity between his past and his present. Although his identity had changed, his skills remained the same. Barbie began to act as an informal advisor on security and intelligence matters, offering his knowledge on social control, the fight against clandestine movements, and repressive organization. These abilities, which in Europe had made him a war criminal, in Bolivia were reinterpreted as useful experience in the face of internal threats. The Cold War played a central role in this reintegration. In Latin America, fear of the expansion of communism led many governments to seek advice from foreign experts in counterinsurgency. Barbie found in this context a new opportunity to place himself at the service of authoritarian regimes, this time not in the name of Nazism but of anti-communism. The ideological change was superficial. The logic of repression remained intact. Over the years, Klaus Barbie lived openly with his family, leading an existence that in appearance did not differ from that of other European immigrants. He attended social events, maintained business relationships, and participated in the daily life of the country. For those who knew him as Klaus Altmann, he was nothing more than a German businessman with an imprecise past. The Butcher of Lyon seemed to have been definitively left behind. However, his presence in Bolivia did not go completely unnoticed. Within communities of European exiles and former Nazi circles, his true identity was known, or at least suspected. Bolivia became a refuge for several former members of the Third Reich, creating an environment in which silence and mutual complicity reinforced impunity. In that context, Barbie was not alone, but integrated into an informal network of former fugitives. As the years went by, his sense of security increased. European justice seemed distant, and his name no longer occupied headlines. This prolonged period of impunity reinforced the idea that he had managed to escape definitively. For Barbie, Bolivia was not only a refugee, but a second life in which he could exercise influence without being pursued by his past. Nevertheless, this new identity was built on a fragile foundation. The history he had tried to erase continued to exist in archives, testimonies, and memories. While he moved freely in Bolivia, in Europe, the victims and investigators did not forget. Over time, interest in Nazi criminals who had escaped began to resurface, and South America started to attract the attention of journalists and Nazi hunters. The life of Klaus Barbie as Klaus Altmann represents one of the most disturbing paradoxes of the post-war period. A man responsible for some of the most atrocious crimes of the 20th century was able to rebuild his life for decades, not in absolute hiding but in broad daylight. His story in Bolivia is not only that of a fugitive, but that of a world that, for political convenience, institutional weakness, or simple indifference, allowed impunity to be prolonged. This stage, apparently calm, was in reality a deceptive calm. Beneath the surface of his new identity, the past was still alive, waiting for the moment when the truth would come to light. That moment would arrive when the silence began to break and the name Klaus Barbie was spoken again. This time not as that of a German businessman, but as that of one of the most wanted Nazi criminals in the world. The final hunt, identification, extradition, and trial. For decades, Klaus Barbie managed to live protected by silence, distance, and the political priorities of the Cold War. However, from the 1970s onward, that fragile balance began to crack. The world had changed. The immediate urgencies of the East-West confrontation began to coexist with a renewed will for historical justice. In Europe, a new generation of investigators, journalists, and survivors refused to accept that those responsible for Nazi crimes should die in freedom. The definitive identification of Klaus Barbie in Bolivia was not the result of a single discovery, but of a slow and persistent process. Investigative journalists and human rights activists began to follow the trail of former Nazis sheltered in South America. Among them stood out figures such as Beata and Serge Klarsfeld, who dedicated their lives to locating war criminals and bringing them to justice. Through documents, testimonies, and personal connections, the name Klaus Altmann began to appear associated with the former head of the Gestapo in Lyon. Suspicions turned into certainty when multiple pieces of evidence confirmed that Klaus Altmann and Klaus Barbie were the same person. Photographs, biographical coincidences, and direct testimonies closed any margin of doubt. Despite this, achieving his extradition was not immediate. For years, the Bolivian government refused to hand him over, protected by his legal status, his ties to sectors of power, and the fear of setting uncomfortable precedents. The Bolivian political context began to change at the beginning of the 1980s. After years of military dictatorships, the country initiated a transition toward a civilian regime. This shift weakened the networks that had protected Barbie and opened the door to a reconsideration of his situation. At the same time, international pressure was increasing. France had not forgotten the crimes committed in Lyon, and Barbie's name remained an open wound in the national memory. In 1983, finally, the turning point occurred. Klaus Barbie was arrested in Bolivia and expelled from the country. Formally, it was not an extradition, but an administrative expulsion, a legal maneuver that made it possible to circumvent legal and political obstacles. However, the result was the same. For the first time since the end of the war, the Butcher of Lyon was in the hands of justice. His arrival in France had an enormous symbolic impact. Images of Barbie descending from the plane, escorted by authorities, traveled around the world. For the victims and their families, that moment represented more than a legal procedure. It was confirmation that time had not erased responsibility. For French society, the case reopened deep debates about occupation, collaboration, and historical memory. The judicial process was complex and charged with tension. Klaus Barbie was accused of crimes against humanity, a category that allowed acts committed decades earlier to be tried without statute of limitations. The trial, held in Lyon in 1987, became one of the most important of the 20th century in France. Not only an individual was being judged, but an entire logic of terror and repression. During the hearings, dozens of witnesses appeared. Survivors of torture, relatives of deportees, and former members of the resistance recounted their experiences before the court. Their testimonies precisely reconstructed the functioning of the Gestapo in Lyon and Barbie's central role in the machinery of terror. Each account restored humanity to the victims and dismantled any attempt to minimize the crimes. Klaus Barbie, for his part, maintained a defiant and distant attitude. He never showed remorse. He presented himself as a soldier who had followed orders, a classic defense that had already been rejected in Nuremberg. His stance reinforced, in the eyes of public opinion, the image of a man incapable of assuming moral responsibility for his actions. The trial made it clear that it was not about revenge, but about justice. The verdict was unequivocal. Klaus Barbie was declared guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence marked the legal end of a life built on violence and impunity. For France, it was an act of moral affirmation. For the international community, a sign that even decades later, the most serious crimes could and should be judged. Barbie died in prison in 1991. His death did not close the debate, but it did seal his fate. The trial left a lasting legacy. It reinforced the importance of memory, of individual responsibility, and of the rejection of any form of relativization of Nazi horror. It also exposed the grey areas of the post-war period, reminding how political interests allowed criminals to escape for years. The final hunt for Klaus Barbie was not only the pursuit of a man, but the confrontation of a society with its own past. It showed that justice can be slow, but not necessarily forgetful, and it left a clear lesson. As long as there is memory and will, even those who believed they had escaped forever can be reached by history.